We're going to be walking through a notebook that downloads a published data source from Tableau Cloud, takes that downloaded data source and extracts the corresponding hyperfile, then builds a CSV from that hyperfile that we can download locally. The motivation behind the notebook is if you're running Tableau Prep in the web browser with Tableau Cloud, you do not have an option to output the results of your prep flow to a CSV that gets saved to a local directory. So this script allows you to effectively work around this by downloading that published data source and building a CSV through a script. So the steps involved will be to authenticate into the Tableau REST API using connected apps, and you'll need to be the admin of your Tableau Cloud site to set that up. Then, using the REST API, we'll query the data source of interest. We'll then download the data source. Because the TDSX file is effectively a zip file, we will unzip that TDSX to grab and extract our hyperfile. Then, using the Tableau Hyper API, we'll read that hyperfile into a pandas data frame. Then lastly, we will build a CSV or export that data frame as a CSV from that pandas data frame. In order to run this Colab notebook, we will be bringing in a config.json file with all of our connected apps private information. You can also kind of edit this notebook and hard code in those variables, or you can download this notebook locally and run it as a Jupyter notebook in your own environment. So let's get started by dragging in our configuration file. And then reading in those variables. So now that we have our connected apps information in, we can build our JWT token, and you can take note that the scopes needed in our JWT token will be Tableau content read and Tableau data sources download. We also just authenticated into the REST API and parsed out our credentials. This credentials will be passed in as a header in all of the subsequent REST API requests. First REST API request will be to query for all the data sources on our site. And we're actually going to build a data frame based on all those data sources and preview the first 5 rows. So I want to use this order sample superstore data source. So it's the 0, 1, 2. So it's the third element, the third data source in my list. And we are going to grab the LUID for that element. So for that third data source in the list. Now that we have that ID, we can pass that ID into our next command, into our next REST API request, which is going to be to download this data source. So I get the message, I'm printing out that the download was successful, and if I refresh my files over here, we can now see filename.tdsx has been read in. So like I mentioned before, a TDSX file is effectively a zip file. So if you were on your doing this manually, you could actually rename the TDSX to .zip, and you can unzip it using any sort of unzipping utility. So we're effectively going to use the zip file package, and we've extracted our contents. So if I refresh this again over here, we now have a new directory, and we can navigate inside this directory to find a hyperfile here. I'm also printing out the full path to this hyperfile that we just extracted. Because Google Colab does not have Tableau's Hyper API pre-installed, we are going to run a pip install command to get that. Okay, looks like it is ready to go, installed. Our next step is going to be to read in our Hyper file and create a pandas data frame. And we can preview the results of our data frame. And the dot head just is going to return 5 rows in all the columns. And now we can just simply run a dataframe.toCSV, and we now have our data source saved locally as a CSV. Thanks for following, and hope this was helpful.